is Margaret Mortensen, and she and her husband during World War II leased the Nampa Airport and ran it. They had the FBO, and they taught aviators, young aviators going to war, how to fly, and she actually taught ground school to many of these guys. So she's going to tell us how historical this airport is and what her experiences were as a young woman running an airport and running an FBO with World War II going on. So I want to introduce to you, her husband's name was Art, by the way, and she's going to talk about some of her memories of that time. She's going to talk about the humiliation that got her into ground school and gave out certificates. I'm dying to hear that. And interesting people that she knew in the industry, and she is going to end the story with flying a Curtiss Robin to the East Coast and driving home in a Packard. And I told her she cannot get in the back seat of our Packard. That belongs to me and John. I'd like to introduce Margaret Mortensen to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sue. Sue, did I ever tell you that I tried to get out of this? I went to my son and I said, Bob, I can't get up and speak in front of all those people. I can't. And my son Bob says, yes, you can, Mother. Oh, no, I can't. So he looked at me and he grinned and he said, remember, Mother, all the times you made me do things that I didn't think I could do? Well, this is payback time. Bob, I'd like you to stand. Let me introduce my son, Bob. Bob has his flying, I think he's got his ground school. No. Anyhow, he flies. Okay, payback. You know, that makes parents look at the saying, watch your children in a whole new different light, doesn't it? They're going to pay back. Okay, I want to, this is the way the airport looked when I came here as a bride. I need a little more light. I got to read this thing. Okay, thank you. I came here right after our wedding ceremony. I met my husband, Art Mortensen, while I was working as a pharmacist here in Idaho. And we both knew we were meant for each other, but we weren't ready for marriage. I was a woman working in a man's field, and when the State Board of Pharmacy, instead of supporting me in the discrimination that I was enduring, dealt me a card off the bottom of the deck, I left Idaho and went to New Mexico to work. Now, before I tell you about our airport and flying experiences, I want to introduce you to the man I married. Art Mortensen brought fame to Idaho before I met him, when he was leading jockey of the racing world. He left his Homedale home when he was 14 to go on the track. He's the larger of the two boys. Look at what kids they were. While he was racing, he often lived with some of the rich and wealthy families that he was working for, and he acquired a lovely, lovely polish from these associations. When he began to grow and found he had to diet, he left the racing world and went into other endeavors. By the time I knew him, he was flying. By the way, he learned to fly on a field that is now where Boise State College stands. He was the smartest, sweetest, kindest, most considerate man I ever met. There just aren't enough good adjectives in the dictionary to describe him. While I was working in New Mexico, Art visited me every time he went to Kansas to buy a new Porterfield airplane. He brought them back here to Nampa, where he was teaching flying. As I remember them, they were tandem. They were a wispy-looking little airplane. I know their top flight speed was about 85 miles an hour. Flying over a road with a headwind, you could look down and see cars passing you. They were not high-tech. They had no electrical system, therefore no starter, so you had to crank it by hand. There were a couple gauges, a compass, a turn and bank indicator. That smiley thing in the middle is the turn and bank indicator. The gas gauge was that wire that you can see sticking out the top. On the bottom of that was a cork. So when your tank was full, the wire was extended clear to the top. The little hook on the top kept the wire from sinking down. Real high tech. When the that little wire went down, the pilots knew they were in trouble. Art took other pilots with him when he was flying to Kansas because he brought back several planes at a time. Now notice in most of these pictures, he's wearing a tie. You don't see that much nowadays, even at funerals or in church. They had to land several times because they had that little small gas tank and they had to refuel. And they usually landed on some farmer's field and carried gas in the back of the plane and the tank and cans in the extra seat. Art said that once when they were taking off on what they thought was a deserted road, a car came over a rise. Art said he had plenty of speed for a liftoff, but the driver of the car was panicked. The odds are that poor man had never even seen an airplane before. When Art and I decided it was time to be together, I came back from New Mexico and we were married in June of 1941. At that time, Art and his partner, Harry Clark, had the lease on this airport and were teaching people to fly. It says there he got home in time for his marriage. I don't remember that very well because he was here. I was full of questions about this airport. When I asked why it was named Ritchie Field, I was told that Ritchie was a Nampa pilot who was killed along with two of his passengers, two young girls, when he was giving passenger hops at the Jerome Airport, the Jerome Fair, the Jerome Fair. Now, isn't that a story a young bride needs to hear when she's just married a man who gives passenger hops and teaches students to fly and takes people hunting? Can you see the deer hanging from the strut? And notice how dressed up he is even hunting. He doesn't have his tie, but he has his straw hat. And it's does he have the tie? Okay, another thing he did was go looking for lost horses. And I was so ignorant of the hazards of flying at that time that I didn't realize how dangerous it was to fly low up and down box canyons in Owyhee County. I only worried about the horse. I don't know if you can read that, but somebody tied the reins to the horn so the horse couldn't even get a drink. Some of my memories of the first weeks around this airport include taxiing down to the end of the runway, where Art would take a .22 and shoot the head off a pheasant, which we'd later fix for dinner. One evening, when I came to pick Art up from work, the airplanes were all tucked into the hangar, but a mechanic was still working on one in the very, very back. A spark must have escaped and set the plane on fire. I marveled at the composure of the crew and all the visitors who quickly began to wheel the planes out of the hangar. The mechanic in the back threw his coat over the flame and extinguished it without any damage to the plane. I never knew whether the company bought the man a new coat or not. Now, pictures, in going through our pictures, I don't have many because Art and I bought a motorhome and we lived in it a couple years. While we were thinning out our possessions, we had a great time burning pictures and memory books. If you want to know how my daughter, who does family history and genealogy, feels about getting rid of her pictures, please see her later. Anne, would you stand? This is my daughter, Anne McClary, who flew down from Seattle to support me on this little talk. Now, I think there should be some pictures of the Nampa Flying Club, and unfortunately, I don't know you could read some of their names there. I understand there's a man here whose grandfather is in one of these pictures. They were doing everything they could at that time to nurture the new industry of flying. Now, in the very middle, on the left is Harry Clark, on the right is my husband Art, in front of those pictures. Okay. We found a picture of Joyce Whitmore. Now, Joyce was one of the gals that was learning to fly here. She was a great lady, as were all of us women, myself included, I thought, because we were knocking on the glass ceiling. Joyce had long dark hair, and she wore it in braids wrapped around her head. One snowy morning, when she was kicking the snow out from in front of the wheels with the engine running, the prop cutter cut one of those braids off, slick as a whistle. She wasn't hurt, but that was a lesson she never forgot. Here's another story. I missed the actual drama, but I heard the story many times. A military pilot landed this plane here on this airport, on the short runway. He got out and he asked, "Where's Gown Field?" He was very embarrassed when he was told he should have been able to see it. He was even more embarrassed when he learned that he probably couldn't take off. They talked about taking the wings off the plane and trucking it over to his base, but that would have gotten him into big doo-doo with the military. So he walked the short runway several times and decided he'd risk the takeoff. He made it, but as soon as he got to Boise, he called back to Nampa and said, "Is that man who was standing on the haystack at the end of the runway okay? I have a nick in my propeller." Somebody walked over to the farmer's residence and found that indeed he had been standing on the haystack. But when he found that the plane was still on the ground near the end of the runway, he flattened himself, but he left his pitchfork standing. When he shakily got to his feet, he found 2 inches gone off the pitchfork handle. Art and I had been married a few weeks when another flight instructor was hired. He took a student up in a new Porterfield Art had just purchased. We never knew what happened, but the plane dove into the ground, killing both men. It was an emotional and financial disaster. The student was paying for his flight time by he had a fur shop in Boise, and he was making both Harry's wife and me a new fur coat to pay for his lessons. I never wore my coat. I busied myself decorating our new apartment and getting acquainted with the neighbors, but I soon found I had idle time on my hand. One evening when I picked Art up from this airport, I found that Harry's wife, who did the bookwork, was working late, and she said she often did because she couldn't keep up with the work, but I found she was typing with 2 fingers. I was an excellent typist, so I graciously offered to help her. She just as graciously told me where I could go. I think there was some mention of my not knowing a nose wheel from a tail wheel, and a few other pointed remarks. I suppose I sulked for a while, and then I set about to rectify the situation. Obviously, I wasn't going to hang around the airport, so I went to the library. You older people will remember we used to have knowledge in books, and we hunted up the books with the Dewey Decimal System. So that's what I did, and I learned that, let's see what I learned. I learned the government had fostered the new flying industry by giving contracts to various airlines to fly the mail. And by the way, in other research, I found that the pilots were paid by the pound, and that registered mail had to be put in a heavy box. So they'd write themselves a postcard and register it so they'd get more mail, get a little bit more money. The regulations for the air were stated in the Air Commerce Act of 1926. In 1938, President Roosevelt got his finger into this pie, and the regulations were changed. So I was real excited about all I'd learned, and I came home and talked to Art about it. It wasn't his idea of pillow talk, so he suggested I get the material that was available for ground school instructors and read up on that. I had no interest in being a ground school instructor, but I did find the material interesting. When they offered an examination, I took it just to see how I was doing. I'd passed flying colors. So then, but I still didn't know anything about airplanes. Regulations were kind of dull, but the next course was meteorology, and that was a science. I love science, so I was off and running on that one. I passed that test, and then I took navigation when I learned there was more to it than following a railroad track. I had trouble learning Morse code. I never got beyond 12 words a minute, but I was never asked to teach that because the high-tech hobby of that day was ham radio. There were lots of people knew code. I had a little trouble with engines, too, not because of the technical material, but I wasn't strong enough to get the bolts out. I don't know why, but at that time they thought that all pilots should be able to dismantle and reassemble an engine, so I did that. Then there was parachute packing. We got a parachute. There's my husband with a parachute. And while I was learning that, one of the parachutes I packed was used by a pilot to save his life. I was real pleased that it opened as it was supposed to. Pretty soon I had all the ratings that they offered and found I was probably the only person in southern Idaho who had them. Other people learned about my new qualifications and pressured me to go to Idaho Falls to teach an experimental high school class. The high wages were tempting because the loss of our plane and the death of the men had stretched our budget. The added incentives were a car and a place to stay. The living quarters were with a man and his wife who had the contract for the course in Idaho Falls, A.A. Bennett and his wife, Hattie. If I had known then what I know now, that would have been the end of my pharmacy career. I would have written a book about his life, and I would now be famous. He never talked to me about his colorful flying career in Alaska, and it isn't now, when I start to revive my memories, that I learned so much about him. This young fellow that stood up and said that he flew in Alaska, I'd like to talk to him about Bennett's memories. Stories I'd love to tell, but time won't allow me here. He flew where no other pilot would fly in Alaska. One story tells about rescuing 2 men and stuffing them into a plane with just 1 extra seat. Bennett did talk to me a lot, though, about having license number 2. He thought he should have had license number 1, and he said it was stolen from him because of politics. I think he was correct. Bennett was born in 1886. He was flying in Alaska in the 1920s, But when they started giving a license in 1927, William McCracken, who was Assistant Secretary of Commerce, gave that number 1 license to himself. Now, I don't think McCracken was quite the rascal that Bennett painted him to be, because he had offered license number 1 to Orville Wright. Orville Wright was no longer flying, and he turned it down. Art's license, that you get about 10 years later, was 78,810. Even if I had wanted to write a book about Bennett, I didn't have much time, because I had my hands full learning how to teach so much material in so little time. Okay, now on that article, I'm going to stop right here. That's the group at Idaho Falls. They were all high school kids. And if you had the original article, they said that the ground school instructor was a mere woman. Okay, then another thing, notice those are all boys. Of course, the government wouldn't teach a girl to fly. And they gave them 8 hours flying time, and if they couldn't solo in that 8 hours, they were washed out. Flight instructors were so scarce that they went clear to Minnesota to get a man to teach this course. His name was Bob Johnson. After the war, Johnson went to Alaska to fly. I guess Bennett told him stories about his Alaska adventures. When I returned home after my 6-week stint, I resolved never to be away from my husband that long again. I took only jobs where he was also teaching. I was free to pick and choose. My husband was not. The government had swooped down and changed our lives. We no longer had a lease on this airport. We no longer owned our planes. Someone in government decided what they would pay Art for his planes, often less than the mortgage. Now all the pilots who, like Art, had instructors' ratings, were under what was called the War Training Service. One would think it would be associated with the Air Force, wouldn't you? No, it was the Navy. The flight instructors were frozen in their jobs and threatened with being sent overseas as apprentice seamen if they resisted. The reasoning was that one flight instructor could teach a lot of men, and we needed pilots badly. In 1939, there were only 55 enlisted pilots in the then U.S. Army Air Corps. I don't know why they moved us around, but they did. While we were still in Nampa, the flying group was here on the Nampa Airport, I was teaching the ground school at the College of Idaho. I worked with a guy named Buck Stunenberg. He was a physics professor and also in charge of the ground school. Now, I think it was his uncle, but maybe it was his father, who was governor of Idaho and was assassinated when somebody put a bomb on his door. Oh, no, not the door, the gate, I guess it was. War Training Service shifted us to Yakima, where the men hated to fly. Yakima was heavy into the culture of hops. Now, you people that live in Idaho know that there's wires over the tops of those poles. And see how tall they are. Now, can you imagine trying to land a plane between 2 hop fields? When we went to Pocatello, my load was lighter as they had located a woman ground school in Alaska, and she came down to help. But finding a place to stay was the problem. People were renting garages with dirt floors, broken boards in the walls. At first we stayed in hotels, but the war rules we could only stay for 3 nights, so we were moving every 4th day. We finally found a family who rented us a room in their attic. Eventually the government threw up some shelters and we were able to rent one of those apartments. Any sound could be heard 2 apartments away. We were all fearful of fire. People with children hated the mud, and gangs of kids, they couldn't keep their children from joining. Art had his share of narrow escapes while we were in this program. Many episodes I didn't hear about until later. I don't know how, but one of his students managed to get the airplane upside down. Another time, and this often happened, that the engine conked out during spins, Art had to seize the controls from a student who froze and make a dead stick landing. When I heard that, I thanked God that didn't happen at Yakima. As the war ground on, the need for pilots decreased. We were able to train men faster than we could build airplanes. Art applied for a discharge, and by some miracle he got it. But on his papers, reason for discharge, his own convenience. Now, do any of you have that on your papers? Let's see a show of hands. Okay. Our next adventure that involved flying was buying a Curtiss Robin airplane and rebuilding it. Our plane was like the one Wrong-Way Corrigan flew across the Atlantic in 1938. Corrigan was a mechanic who helped build the Spirit of St. Louis, the plane that Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. He wanted to emulate Lindbergh, so when he bought his Curtiss Robin, he put new engines and extra gas tanks in the plane and named it Sunshine. To test his plane, he tried to fly it nonstop across the U.S. Part the way to the East Coast, one tank developed a gas leak. When he landed, he had 4 gallons of gas left. He had been trying for 3 years to get permission to make a flight across the Atlantic, and they denied it. Finally, the authorities, to thwart him, took the airworthiness certificate away from his plane, probably because it looked so bad. One wag said it looked like something a kid would build out of boxes and roller skates. They did give his plane an experimental rating so he could still fly it. So he felt real successful flying from California to New York, so he decided to make the trip of his dreams across the Atlantic without permission. He filled the gas tanks, including the leaking one. Fixing it would have taken a week. And he took, he took 2 chocolate bars, 2 boxes of fig bars, and a quart of water. And the weather was just what he was hoping for, dense, dense fog. The only navigational thing he had other than his compass was a map of the United States marked from New York to California. On July 17th, Corrigan started the plane himself, checked the engine by flashlight, and took off heading east. The plane was so weighted down that it traveled 3,200 feet down the runway before leaving the ground and cleared the fence by 50 feet. After about 10 hours flying, Corrigan's feet became cold. He discovered the gas leak was worse, flooding the floor of the cockpit. He was afraid it'd leak out on the side where the exhaust was, so he took the only tool he brought with him, a screwdriver, punched a hole in the cockpit floor on the side opposite the exhaust so the gasoline would run out. Now the plane wasn't quite so apt to explode. He had no way of knowing how much gasoline he had, and he knew from the trip across the United States that he had a very small margin of error. So because the gas leak was worse, he increased his RPM from 1,000 to 1,900 and flew straight ahead. When he saw a small fishing boat, he realized that land must be close, so he opened a box of fig bars to celebrate. He had finished the fig bars and was working on a chocolate bar when land came in sight. He landed in Dublin on July 18th, where he was met by an army officer. Corrigan introduced himself and said, I got mixed, he said, I left New York yesterday morning heading for California. I got mixed up in the clouds and must have flown the wrong way. He stuck to his story. He had no passport, no maps of Europe, Eventually, the plane was shipped back to the United States on a boat. All the newspaper articles referred to him as Wrong Way Corrigan, so he capitalized on the publicity. He even marketed a clock that ran backwards. Art remodeled our Curtis Robin by taking out the heavy glass and installing plexiglass windows, changing the wheels, redoing the fabric, installing the self-starter, and making it as new as possible. Then we advertised it for sale. From all the offers we got, we decided to take one a guy in Old Town, Maine offered. In June of 1945, Art and I flew the Robin to Maine, taking our time, enjoying the adventure. When we collected our money, we rode the train down to Troy, New York. It was a regular-looking train, but it traveled about the speed of a wheelbarrow, stopped at every farm to take on farm produce. I was amazed when a man led a sheep up and hoisted her into one of the cars. No cage, no diaper, no anything. A man came through the passenger car selling cheese sandwiches. We got real excited. We hadn't had cheese in 3 years. Just because something was rationed didn't mean that it was available. So we both ordered 2 cheese sandwiches. Imagine our chagrin when we found it was cottage cheese. I've never had another cottage cheese sandwich. We were in for another disappointment when we reached Troy and found all westbound trains were standing room only. After a conference, we went heading for cars and found a Packard with fair tires. Now, there's no need for a picture of our Packard because it's just exactly like the one that you have here in this museum, except ours was shiny black. In fact, I was hoping it would be the same one, but Sue tells me it isn't. We bought all the inner tube patching, the material that the man at the car dealership would sell us, and we started west, learning how to bargain for black market gasoline. Our inner tubes had patches on the patches when we stopped for lunch someplace in Minnesota. It was a hot day, and our Packard was parked on hot asphalt. As we were eating, we heard 4 loud bangs. Every tire had blown out. When we arrived back in Nampa, Art took the car to a dealership. The owner was delighted to give us our price, but he wanted us to hurry back east and buy him another car. After our hellish trip, we could only laugh at such an outlandish suggestion. Well, that's enough of my memories, folks. I know you all want to go home and make a cottage cheese sandwich.
Isn't she fantastic? So, how old were you when you moved here to Nampa?
Oh, we don't talk age.
Oh, she's only 49 now. Isn't she awesome? Does anybody have any questions or any memories of that early time that she's talking about here at Nampa? Did anybody know any of those people? Yeah, you're it. You better be writing a book. Thank you so much. And this is a gift for you from the Warhawk Air Museum. It's one of our coins. We hope you'll always keep it, and you'll come back and visit us whenever you can since you're local. Okay, you're welcome. Thanks again. Wasn't that wonderful?